Launched on February 21st, Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to land on the Moon, the fifth mission of NASA's Project Apollo, and the first mission in RTTM history to result in a complete loss of crew and vehicle. Apollo 11 was commanded by Neil Armstrong on his second spaceflight, with Mike Collins as command module pilot on his second spaceflight, and Buzz Aldrin as lunar module pilot on his second spaceflight. Launch was less than textbook. Neil forgot to jettison the heavy launch abort tower after S1C staging. The additional mass of the tower weighed down the launch vehicle, absorbing delta V over time. Eventually, Buzz caught on to Neil's mistake and jettisoned the tower himself. To correct for the late tower jettison, Houston burned the S4B for 10 seconds longer than planned to make up the lost velocity. However, this burn extension was miscalculated and resulted in an overcorrection of Apollo 11's initial parking orbit. Though launch was bumpy, things quickly smoothed out. Translunar injection, transposition and docking extraction, the departure cruise, and lunar orbit insertion all went nominally. The one error that occurred on the way to the Moon was when the crew accidentally left the fuel cell tank fans on after the mid-course correction burn, an ominous foreshadowing of the tragedy to come. It's likely that this first occurrence of tank fan overuse inflicted minor structural damage to the fuel cell tanks, making them more susceptible to further damage later on in the mission. After 2 nights in lunar orbit, Neil and Buzz transferred into the Eagle and undocked, leaving Mike to himself in the Columbia. After lowering the Eagle down into its descent orbit and completing their pre-PDI procedures, Neil and Buzz fired the Eagle's descent stage engine for the most important phase of the mission, powered descent initiation, aka lunar landing. Due to an unidentified error, Neil deduced that the LEM was going to land further downrange than planned by tracking specific lunar landmarks through his window. The fact that they were landing in uncharted territory increased the already unbelievable pressure on the crew exponentially. To make things even more nerve-wracking, a series of 1202 and 1201 program alarms were triggered by the AGC shortly afterwards. These alarms indicated that the computer was being overloaded with data. This error was caused accidentally by Buzz when he misflipped a few switches during his and Neil's preparation for PDI. Luckily, none of these problems had a major effect on the crew or spacecraft, and Neil guided the Eagle to a pinpoint landing just beyond the vicinity of the Little West Crater in the Sea of Tranquility, accomplishing the first half of President Kennedy's lunar goal of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth. A couple hours after landing, Apollo 11's only lunar EVA commenced. In it, Neil became the first human to walk on the Moon, with Buzz becoming the second, and the two worked to accomplish an array of scientific and technical tasks. After spending a long and uncomfortable night on the Moon, including having to keep their full suits on due to concerns of dust particle inhalation, Neil and Buzz fired their ascent stage engine and rocketed the LEM into the lunar sky. Neil had to arm the ascent engine using the tip of a pen after Buzz accidentally hit the circuit breaker that controlled the engine arming with his suit's PLSS as the two prepped for their EVA, breaking it. Buzz was knocked to the floor of the LEM shortly after the start of the lunar ascent. He had forgotten to strap himself down to the floor before ignition. The fall cracked his helmet, making it useless in the event of a cabin depressurization. After inserting themselves back into a lunar orbit and assessing Buzz's suit damage, the two astronauts started the rendezvous sequence with the Columbia. Though they missed their first burn window, Neil and Buzz recovered the sequence and successfully rendezvoused and docked with the Columbia in lunar orbit a few hours later. After spending one last night in the Moon's orbit, the crew jettisoned the Eagle, abandoning it to naturally collide with the lunar surface a few weeks later. They then fired up the Columbia's SPS engine for the 4th time on the mission to plant themselves on a trajectory back to Earth. 2 days into the lunar return cruise, the 3 astronauts did a 5th SPS burn to correct their re-entry trajectory with Earth. One of the prep procedures for this burn involves stirring the infamous oxygen and hydrogen tanks to the Columbia's fuel cells. In a worsened repeat of the same mistake they had made during the arrival cruise, the crew left the fuel cell tank fans on again, this time for nearly 6 hours. Later that evening, multiple strange noises were reported by the crew before the 3 fuel cell oxygen tanks ruptured under their own pressure. leaking their innards into the vacuum of space and starving the fuel cells of oxygen, ending the combustion cycle and therefore ceasing all electrical generation from the cells. The Columbia automatically switched over to its low-output descent batteries for electricity. The batteries only stored enough electricity to power the Columbia for 5 hours. The crew immediately turned off all non-essential spacecraft systems to conserve power. Realizing how little time they had and being out of comms range from Houston, the Apollo 11 crew quickly devised a plan to get the fuel cells running again. The plan called for Neil to perform an EVA to externally transfer oxygen from the SPS O2 tanks to the fuel cell O2 tanks using an improvised watermill-like technique. The crew quickly prepped for this EVA, and Neil was outside of the spacecraft in no time preparing to execute the plan. During this period, Columbia re-entered comms range with Houston, and the crew briefed Mission Control on the unfolding situation. However, Houston ordered Neil back inside, feeling that the crew's repair plan was too risky and unfeasible. The crew complied and ended the emergency EVA. Houston devised a much simpler alternate plan, opting not to attempt to repair the fuel cells, but to instead use extreme power management techniques to stretch the power supply of the descent batteries long enough for the crew to get home. This involved the crew donning their full suits for oxygen and periodically turning the batteries completely off and back on again. The spacecraft would spend most of the time completely dead, drifting silently through space. The crew would use their suits for thermal management and would manually clamp the Columbia's O2 flow valves open to maintain oxygen flow into their helmets while the spacecraft was powered down. One consequence of this plan was that Houston had no way of contacting the crew 90% of the time, as the comm system would almost always be powered down. Houston's plan ended up working better than expected, and the spacecraft now had more than enough power to make it home safely on only the descent batteries. However, panicking slightly and not fully trusting Houston's judgment, Neil performed an unauthorized manual radial inburn of the Columbia's SPS to accelerate their trajectory for re-entry, enabling an earlier splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean. Little did Neil know that this burn is what would kill him and his crewmates. He had calculated the burn using false data from Houston, which resulted in a much earlier re-entry time than he had anticipated. He didn't inform Houston of this fateful burn, and went back to his business of periodically cycling the batteries to conserve power. Much later into the night, all 3 crew members had dozed off as they awaited their next power cycle period. And at around 4 to 5 a.m. Eastern on March 2nd, Columbia unexpectedly re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, completely unprepared. The spacecraft broke up over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida due to extreme G-forces and re-entry heating. The re-entry was mistaken by the U.S. Navy to be a meteorite impact, and the impact area was investigated by a naval vessel. It wasn't until around 9 a.m. that the U.S. Navy discovered human remains and various Apollo spacecraft cabin items drifting within the impact area. NASA was contacted and informed of the news, and the U.S. Navy launched a recovery effort. Mission Control in Houston remained fully active until around noon, hoping to receive a radio transmission from the Columbia. After noon came and went with no radio contact established, most of the personnel in Houston were dismissed from the mission, with a few remaining to monitor the radio frequency for the rest of the day in one last bout of hope. No radio contact was ever established, and by midnight that night, Houston was fully closed down. The recovered remains of the crew were buried in a tomb at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., with full military honors. The funeral was attended by several thousand people, including President Richard Nixon himself. The cause of the Apollo 11 disaster was deemed pilot error by NASA and the NTSB, and several upgrades were made to future Apollo spacecraft, with the exception of Apollo 12, to hopefully prevent a similar incident. These upgrades included partial automation of the fuel cell tank fans and heaters, a large backup fuel cell oxygen tank capable of supporting all 3 fuel cells for 6 days for redundancy purposes. The backup fuel cell oxygen tank could be isolated from the fuel cells, which ensured that if the entire fuel cell power system failed, there would at least be enough breathable oxygen to get the astronauts home. The wiring conduits inside the fuel cell oxygen tanks were changed from Teflon, which were flammable, to stainless steel, which was non-flammable. An additional heater was added to each fuel cell tank. Each of the fuel cell tank heaters and each oxygen tank could be controlled individually. Previously, the crew could only turn them all on or all off. Previously, the tanks had depended on thermostats to control temperature inside of them. Temperature sensors were added to the oxygen tanks and the thermostats were removed. And a 400 amp per hour lunar module descent stage battery was added to the CSM, increasing CSM descent battery life to 6 days. Additional water storage bags were also added. The recovered remains of the Columbia were hauled ashore by the U.S. Navy and put in permanent private storage at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, in the same hangar as the destroyed Apollo 1 spacecraft. These systematic changes mentioned above were excluded from the Apollo 12 spacecraft due to the major delays it would cause to the vitally important mission. They were deemed non-essential for that mission as the Apollo 11 disaster was caused by pilot error, not mechanical failure, and President Kennedy's moon goal took priority to the implementation of these additional safety features.